Have you ever had the ground ripped out from under you, realizing the people you trusted most had betrayed you in ways you couldn't imagine? That was the question looping through my mind as I sat in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by packed boxes, and stared at the letter in my hand. It wasn't the letter itself that shocked me. It was what it represented. My entire world falling apart. My name is Hannah. I'm 19 and a freshman at Mission College in San Jose, California. Until recently, I thought I had a handle on my life. I grew up believing that family was the unshakable foundation you could always lean on, no matter how rough things got. But that belief started to crumble the day my dad sat me down in the living room and told me, in no uncertain terms, that I needed to figure out how to pay for college on my own. "We're stretched too thin," he had said, his voice tight and controlled as he avoided looking me in the eye. "It's time for you to stand on your own 2 feet." Across from him, my stepmother Miranda had sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, nodding along like some dutiful puppet. The whole scene felt rehearsed, like they'd practiced their lines in the mirror before delivering the bombshell. "But you said you'd cover my tuition?" I stammered, my voice cracking. "That was the deal when I got accepted." "We didn't expect things to get this tight," Miranda interjected, her tone a little too sweet, like sugar coating a dagger. "You're smart, Hannah. You'll figure it out." At first, I tried to reason with them, to ask what had changed so drastically that the promises they'd made were suddenly worthless. But they shut me down with vague excuses about unexpected expenses and family priorities. What made it worse was the timing. I'd just started my 2nd semester and had no backup plan. The scholarships I'd earned covered part of my costs, but the rest, thousands of dollars, had come from my dad. Without it, I was looking at a pile of debt I couldn't climb out of. I remember storming out of the room, my heart pounding with anger and confusion. Why now? Why would they pull the rug out from under me when I was already halfway through the year? The answer, I soon discovered, lay in the lives of my step-siblings, Dylan and Chloe. Growing up, my dad and I had always been close. It was just the 2 of us for a long time after my mom passed away when I was 7. He was my rock, my cheerleader, the one who encouraged me to dream big and work hard. But that started to change when Miranda came into the picture. Miranda was polished and sophisticated, a manager at a trendy coffee shop in Sacramento. She had 2 kids from her previous marriage, Dylan, 18, and Chloe, 17. They were charming enough on the surface, but there was always this subtle tension, this unspoken divide between them and me. At first, I tried to be understanding. Blending families isn't easy, and I knew Miranda wanted to make her kids feel at home. But over time, it became clear that her definition of home didn't include me. Little things started to pile up. My dad, who once never missed a single parent-teacher meeting, suddenly couldn't make time to attend my college orientation. Meanwhile, Dylan and Chloe seemed to get whatever they wanted. A new car for Dylan, designer clothes for Chloe, even a trip to Europe last summer to expand their horizons. I tried to push down the resentment, to tell myself it wasn't worth the fight. But when my dad told me I had to pay my own tuition while watching Dylan unbox the latest iPhone across the dinner table, something inside me snapped. A few nights after the confrontation, I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing with questions I couldn't answer. Why did they suddenly have no money for me? What were these unexpected expenses they kept hinting at? Desperation drove me to snoop. I know how bad that sounds, but I needed answers. So, when everyone else was asleep, I crept into the guest room where Dylan and Chloe kept their overnight bags. I unzipped Dylan's bag first, my heart pounding like a drum. Inside, I found a sleek laptop, a pair of brand new sneakers, and several expensive-looking watches still in their boxes. Chloe's bag was even more absurd. Designer handbags, a stack of high-end makeup, and a gold bracelet that still had the price tag dangling from it. It was like a punch to the gut. While I was being told to scrounge up thousands of dollars to stay in school, my dad and Miranda were showering Dylan and Chloe with luxuries they didn't even appreciate. The next morning, I confronted Dylan in the kitchen. "Where did all that stuff come from?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He shrugged, not even looking up from his cereal. "Mom and your dad bought it." "Why?" "Why?" I echoed, incredulous. "Because they just told me we're too broke to pay for my tuition." Dylan didn't even blink. "It's not my problem," he said casually. "Maybe they're just prioritizing the people who matter." The words stung more than I wanted to admit, but they also confirmed what I'd suspected all along. To Miranda, I didn't matter. And to my dad, I was starting to wonder if I ever really had. That day, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I went to visit my grandparents, Henry and Margaret, who lived a few hours away in Santa Barbara. They'd always been my safe haven, the kind of people who would drop everything to help me if I needed them. Sitting at their kitchen table, I told them everything. How my dad had cut off my tuition, how Dylan and Chloe were living like royalty, and how I felt like a stranger in my own family. My grandparents listened quietly, their faces growing darker with every word. When I finished, my grandpa leaned back in his chair and said, "This doesn't add up. We've been sending your dad money every month to cover your expenses." I stared at him, stunned. "What?" My grandma nodded. "Since your mom passed, we've been helping out. It was supposed to go toward your education and anything else you needed." The realization hit me like a freight train. The money that was meant for me had been funding Dylan and Chloe's lavish lifestyle. My dad hadn't just let me down, he'd betrayed me. For the first time in my life, I felt the full weight of what it meant to be on my own. But I also felt something else stirring inside me. Resolve. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. You'd think discovering that my tuition money had been funneled into Dylan and Chloe's luxury lifestyle would have been the worst part. But no, what I found next was worse, and it flipped my world upside down. After leaving my grandparents' house that day, I decided to confront my dad directly. If there was ever a time to demand answers, it was now. I wasn't sure how he'd react, but I wasn't going to let him sidestep this conversation like he always did. When I got home, the house was unusually quiet. Miranda was out with her kids, probably shopping for another round of gadgets and designer clothes. My dad was in his office, the door slightly ajar, his face buried in his laptop. "Dad, we need to talk," I said, stepping into the room without waiting for an invitation. He glanced up, surprised, and then frowned. "Hannah, now's not a good time." "It's never a good time with you," I shot back, my voice sharper than I intended. "But we're talking. Right now." He sighed and leaned back in his chair, looking more annoyed than concerned. "Fine. What is it?" I crossed my arms, trying to keep my composure. "Grandma and Grandpa told me they've been sending you money for years. Money that was supposed to cover my tuition and living expenses. Care to explain why I'm suddenly paying for college on my own while Dylan and Chloe are living like royalty?" For a moment, he didn't say anything. His face twitched, and I could see the gears turning in his head, scrambling for an excuse. "That money was meant for the family," he finally said, his tone defensive. "It's not just about you, Hannah. There are 4 of us now, and we have to think about everyone." "Everyone?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You mean your stepkids, who have their own dad to support them? What about me? Do I not count as part of this family?" "Of course you do," he said quickly, but the words felt hollow. "But things are more complicated than you realize. There are priorities." "Priorities?" I snapped. "Like buying Dylan a new car or letting Chloe shop for designer handbags. Is that why you've been stealing from Grandma and Grandpa?" That word, stealing, made him flinch, but I didn't care. It was the truth, and he needed to hear it. "Enough," he said, slamming his hand on the desk. "You don't understand the pressures I'm under. Miranda and the kids." "Miranda and the kids?" I interrupted, my voice trembling with anger. "I'm your daughter, Dad. Your responsibility, but you've been treating me like an afterthought ever since she came into the picture." He opened his mouth to argue, but I didn't give him the chance. "You lied to me, to Grandma and Grandpa, and to yourself. You've been funneling money into a life that isn't even yours, all while leaving me to fend for myself. Do you even realize what you've done?" For a second, I thought I saw guilt flicker across his face, but it was quickly replaced by something else. Frustration, maybe even anger. "I don't owe you an explanation," he said coldly. "You're old enough to take care of yourself." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Old enough? I'm 19, Dad. I'm still in college, trying to build a future for myself, and you've decided I'm on my own? How can you justify this? He didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to his laptop, as if the conversation was over. "I don't have time for this, Hannah. If you want to stay in college, figure it out. I've done everything I can." I left his office shaking with rage. The nerve of him, acting like he was the victim in all of this. But as furious as I was, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Something he wasn't telling me. That night, I waited until everyone else was asleep. Then, with my heart pounding, I snuck back into his office. The door wasn't locked, it never was, and his laptop was sitting on the desk, the screen dark. I hesitated for a moment, my stomach churning with guilt. But then I thought about all the lies, the betrayal, the money that was supposed to be mine. If he wasn't going to be honest with me, I'd find the truth myself. I opened the laptop, relieved to find it wasn't password protected, and started digging. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just spreadsheets, emails, and invoices for everyday expenses. But then I stumbled across a folder labeled Private. I clicked on it, my hands trembling. Inside were dozens of files, bank statements, payment records, and emails, detailing financial transactions that made my blood run cold. My dad wasn't just spending money on Dylan and Chloe. He'd also been investing large sums into some kind of business venture, a partnership with a man named Kyle R. The emails between them were filled with promises of big returns and phrases like groundbreaking opportunity and guaranteed success. But the most damning part, the business was a scam. Buried in one of the emails was a message from someone warning my dad that Kyle was a con artist, that his business was nothing more than a glorified pyramid scheme. The email was dated months ago, long before my dad had told me he couldn't afford my tuition. I sat there staring at the screen, my mind racing. My dad had gambled away the money meant for my education on a get-rich-quick scheme, and he'd known it was a scam. He'd known. The next morning, I confronted him again, this time with the evidence in hand. "Explain this," I demanded, throwing a stack of printed emails onto his desk. He glanced at the papers, his face going pale. "Where did you get these?" "That doesn't matter," I said. "What matters is that you lied to everyone. Me, Grandma, Grandpa, and for what? To throw money at a scam? Hannah, you don't understand? Stop telling me I don't understand," I shouted. "I understand perfectly. You were willing to sacrifice my future for some stupid pipe dream. How could you do this to me?" He didn't answer. He just sat there, staring at the papers like they might burst into flames. That's when I realized he wasn't going to own up to it. He wasn't going to apologize or try to make things right. He was too proud, too stubborn to admit he'd failed. "You're pathetic," I said, my voice trembling. "You've destroyed everything, and for what? A scam. You don't deserve to call yourself my father." With that, I walked out of his office, slamming the door behind me. But I wasn't done. If my dad thought he could get away with this, he was dead wrong. I thought discovering the scam would be the worst of it. I thought I'd finally hit rock bottom, that there couldn't possibly be more betrayal lurking beneath the surface. I was wrong. After my confrontation with my dad, things at home were tense. Miranda avoided me completely, her icy glares a constant reminder of where her loyalties lay. Dylan and Chloe seemed oblivious, still flaunting their shiny new toys without a care in the world. And my dad? He buried himself in his office, refusing to acknowledge the storm he'd created. But I couldn't let it go, not after everything I'd uncovered. My dad's lies weren't just mistakes. They were deliberate choices that had left me scrambling to hold on to my future. I needed answers, and I was determined to find them. A week later, I got my chance. My dad and Miranda had gone out for dinner, probably some attempt to pretend their lives weren't falling apart, and Dylan and Chloe were holed up in their rooms. It was the perfect opportunity to do some digging. I went back to my dad's office, my heart pounding as I closed the door behind me. His laptop was locked this time, but I knew he kept a notebook in his desk, a physical record of his finances. It was a long shot, but I was desperate. I rifled through the drawers, my hands shaking as I pushed aside old receipts and junk mail. Finally, in the bottom drawer, I found it. A black leather notebook with his initials embossed on the cover. I flipped it open, my breath catching as I scanned the pages. It wasn't just a record of the scam. It was a detailed account of every dollar he'd received from my grandparents, and how he'd spent it. And the deeper I read, the more horrifying it became. The notebook revealed that my dad hadn't just used the money for the scam, or Dylan and Chloe's luxuries. He'd also been funneling it into secret bank accounts under Miranda's name. It wasn't just about keeping her kids happy, it was about building a safety net for himself and his new family. And then I saw it, a single entry that made my stomach drop. Transfer, Hannah's college fund to Miranda's savings account. My college fund, the money my grandparents had set aside specifically for my education. He'd drained it completely, leaving me with nothing. I stared at the words, my mind racing. How could he do this to me? How could he take something meant for my future and use it to secure Miranda's? The betrayal was staggering. But as much as I wanted to scream to confront him right then and there, I knew I needed more. If I was going to take this to my grandparents, I needed proof. Solid, undeniable proof. The next day, I called my grandparents and asked if I could come over. I didn't tell them why, but they could hear the urgency in my voice. When I arrived, I handed them the notebook, my hands trembling. "You need to see this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. They read in silence, their expressions darkening with each page. My grandma's hands were shaking by the time she closed the notebook, and my grandpa looked angrier than I'd ever seen him. "This is unforgivable," he said, his voice low and steady. "He's not just misusing the money, he's stealing it." My grandma nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "Hannah, I'm so sorry, we had no idea." "It's not your fault," I said quickly, "but we need to do something. He's not going to stop unless we make him." My grandpa nodded, his jaw set. "We're going to the lawyer." That night, I told my dad what I'd done. I wanted him to know that his lies were catching up to him, that he couldn't keep hiding behind excuses and manipulation. He exploded. "You had no right," he shouted, his face red with anger. This is a family matter, Hannah, not something to take to outsiders. Outsiders? I shot back, my voice shaking with rage. Grandma and Grandpa are the only reason I even had a college fund in the first place. They trusted you, Dad, and you betrayed them. You betrayed me. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought he might actually apologize. But then he said something that made my blood run cold. You don't understand how hard it's been for me, he said. Do you think I wanted to do this? Do you think I had a choice? Miranda and her kids, they needed me. I had to make sacrifices. Sacrifices? I repeated, my voice trembling. You call stealing my future a sacrifice? You call lying to your own parents a sacrifice? No, Dad, that's not a sacrifice. That's selfishness. He didn't respond. He just stared at me, his jaw clenched, his eyes filled with something that looked almost like shame. But I didn't care anymore. I was done trying to understand him, done trying to make excuses for his behavior. You've made your choices, I said, my voice steady. Now you have to live with them. Over the next few weeks, things spiraled out of control. My grandparents' lawyer filed a formal complaint against my dad, demanding the immediate return of the stolen funds. My dad tried to fight it, claiming he'd acted in the best interest of the family, but the evidence was overwhelming. Miranda, meanwhile, started distancing herself from the chaos. She stopped coming home as often, and when she did, she barely spoke to my dad. I overheard her on the phone one night, telling someone she couldn't afford to be involved in a legal battle. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, Miranda left. She took Dylan and Chloe and moved in with her parents, leaving my dad to deal with the fallout on his own. The house felt emptier after that, but not in a comforting way. My dad was a wreck, pacing the halls and muttering under his breath about how everything had gone wrong. He started drinking more, his once perfect facade crumbling before my eyes. But I didn't feel sorry for him. Not anymore. He'd made his bed, and now he had to lie in it. I always thought confronting my dad about the stolen money would be the hardest part of this ordeal, but I underestimated the chaos that would follow. With Miranda gone, the house felt less crowded, but it was far from peaceful. My dad was unraveling. His polished exterior, the confident provider, the charming family man, was gone, replaced by someone bitter, desperate, and unapologetic. The lawsuit from my grandparents was in full swing. Their lawyer wasn't playing around. Every bank statement, every receipt, and every transaction was being combed through, exposing every lie my dad had buried under layers of fake smiles and hollow promises. My dad, however, refused to accept the reality of what he'd done. You've ruined everything, he spat at me one night as I walked into the kitchen. His tone was venomous, and his words cut deeper than I wanted to admit. I set my glass on the counter and turned to face him. I didn't ruin anything, Dad. You did that all on your own. He slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing through the empty house. This family could have worked if you hadn't gone running to your grandparents. Do you have any idea what you've done to me? I clenched my fists, my heart racing with a mix of anger and heartbreak. What I've done to you. You stole from me, Dad. You took money meant for my future and spent it on people who don't even care about you. You lied to me, to Grandma and Grandpa, to everyone. Don't you dare make me the villain here. His face twisted with frustration, but he didn't respond. For once, he didn't have an excuse or a lie to throw in my face. I stared at him for a moment longer, then turned and left the room. I couldn't stand to look at him anymore. As the legal battle continued, I decided it was time to take control of my life. I couldn't keep living in this house, surrounded by the remnants of my dad's mistakes. It was suffocating. So I reached out to my grandparents and told them what I'd been thinking. I need to leave, I said during one of our phone calls. I can't stay here anymore. It's toxic, and I feel like I'm drowning. My grandma didn't hesitate. Come stay with us, sweetheart. We'll make room for you. You don't have to go through this alone. Her words were a lifeline, and I clung to them. Within a week, I packed up my things and moved in with my grandparents. It wasn't an easy decision. I'd spent my entire life trying to make my dad proud, trying to be the daughter he could depend on. But I finally realized that I couldn't sacrifice myself for someone who wouldn't do the same for me. Moving out wasn't the end of the drama. My dad's anger only escalated when he realized I was serious about cutting ties. He started calling me, leaving long-winded voicemails filled with guilt trips and thinly veiled threats. You're turning your back on your family, one voicemail said. Don't think you're better than us just because your grandparents are bailing you out. I blocked his number after that. I didn't need his toxicity invading the small space of peace I was trying to create for myself. The twist came about 2 weeks after I moved out. My grandparents' lawyer had found something shocking during the investigation. My dad had been funneling money not just into Miranda's accounts, but into offshore accounts as well. He'd been hiding assets for years, all while pretending to struggle financially. When my grandparents confronted him with this evidence, he tried to deny it, but the paper trail was undeniable. The revelation was a final blow to whatever trust anyone had left in him. It was no longer just about the stolen money. It was about a pattern of deceit that stretched back years. For me, it was the nail in the coffin. Any lingering hope I had of rebuilding our relationship was gone. My dad wasn't just someone who made mistakes. He was someone who intentionally hurt the people who loved him to serve his own interests. The day the legal settlement was finalized, my grandparents called me into the living room to talk. The court ruled in our favor, my grandpa said, his tone serious. Your dad has to repay everything he took plus damages. It was a small victory, but it felt hollow. No amount of money could undo the damage he'd caused. Still, I was grateful to my grandparents for standing up for me when I couldn't. What happens now? I asked. My grandma sighed, her expression heavy with sadness. That's up to him, but you don't have to worry about him anymore, Hannah. You've done everything you can. The rest is his responsibility. That night, I sat alone in my room, reflecting on everything that had happened. The betrayal, the lies, the heartbreak, it had all brought me to this moment. And while the pain was still raw, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: relief. For the first time, I was free from the manipulation, the guilt, and the weight of my dad's mistakes. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. I was done being a pawn in his game. Leaving my dad and the chaos he created felt like stepping out of a storm into calm waters. For the first time in years, I had the space to breathe, to think, and to figure out who I was without his shadow looming over me. But breaking free wasn't just about cutting ties. It was about building a life that was truly my own. The first step was focusing on my education. With my grandparents' unwavering support, I was able to stay in school. I threw myself into my studies, not just to prove to others that I could succeed, but to prove it to myself. I joined clubs, volunteered, and made connections with people who lifted me up instead of dragging me down. Slowly, I started to see a future where I wasn't defined by my dad's mistakes. But as much as I tried to move on, the fallout from his actions continued to follow me. One day, my grandparents called me into the living room. They looked serious, and I could tell something was weighing on them. "What's wrong?" I asked, my heart sinking. Grandpa held up a letter. "This came in the mail today. It's from your dad." I hesitated before taking it, my hands trembling slightly. I hadn't heard from him since the settlement, and part of me hoped I never would. But curiosity got the better of me. I opened the letter and started reading. The letter was filled with a mix of apologies and excuses. My dad claimed he was trying to rebuild his life, that he regretted everything he'd done, and that he wanted to make amends. But buried between the lines of remorse was a request. He wanted money. He didn't outright say it, but the implication was clear. He wanted me to help him get back on his feet, to bail him out of the mess he'd created. I felt a familiar surge of anger rise in me. After everything he'd done, after all the pain and betrayal, he still had the audacity to ask for something from me. But this time, I wasn't the scared, confused daughter who wanted his approval. I was stronger now, and I knew what I had to do. I handed the letter back to my grandparents. "I don't want to respond. He made his choices, and now he has to live with them." My grandma nodded, her expression soft but proud. "You're doing the right thing, sweetheart. You don't owe him anything." The next few months were a whirlwind of growth and healing. I started therapy, which helped me process the years of emotional manipulation and neglect. I learned how to set boundaries, how to stand up for myself, and how to let go of the guilt that had weighed me down for so long. In therapy, I realized that my dad's behavior wasn't a reflection of my worth. It was a reflection of his own flaws and insecurities. That realization was both freeing and heartbreaking. For so long, I'd blamed myself for his actions, but now I could see the truth. I wasn't the problem. He was. As I focused on my future, opportunities started to come my way. I was offered a scholarship to a prestigious university, and for the first time in years, I felt excited about what was ahead. My grandparents were over the moon, and they threw me a small celebration to mark the occasion. It wasn't extravagant, but it was filled with love and support, and that meant more to me than any grand gesture ever could. One of the most unexpected moments came during the celebration. My phone buzzed with a notification, a message request on social media. It was from Miranda, my former stepmom. I hesitated before opening it, unsure of what to expect. The message was short and to the point. "I heard about the lawsuit. I'm sorry for my part in everything. I didn't realize how much damage we were doing." It wasn't the apology I wanted, but it was something. I didn't reply, but reading her words made me realize just how far I'd come. I didn't need her validation or her guilt. I was moving on, with or without her. By the time I left for college, I felt like a new person. I was no longer the girl who lived in fear of disappointing her dad or the one who felt trapped by his manipulations. I was free to be myself, to chase my dreams, and to build a life that was entirely my own. As for my dad, I heard through the grapevine that he'd been struggling to keep his head above water. His business ventures had all failed, and he was in serious debt. Part of me felt sorry for him, but I knew better than to get involved. He'd made his bed, and now he had to lie in it. The biggest twist came a year later. My grandparents called me to let me know that the offshore accounts my dad had been hiding had been frozen, and the remaining money was being used to pay back his debts. It wasn't enough to fix everything, but it was a step toward justice. Knowing that he couldn't escape the consequences of his actions was the closure I needed. In the end, the story wasn't about revenge or retribution. It was about reclaiming my life. My dad's downfall wasn't my victory. My success was. And as I sat in my dorm room, surrounded by books and dreams, I realized that I didn't need him to validate my worth. I was enough, just as I was. Looking back, I'm grateful for the lessons I've learned. I found strength in the love of my grandparents, in the support of my friends, and in my own resilience. My dad's betrayal may have shaped me, but it didn't define me. I was free, and that freedom was the greatest gift of all. Years have passed since I last spoke to my dad. In that time, I've grown in ways I never imagined. Moving forward wasn't easy. It was a process of healing, redefining my worth, and learning to embrace a future unshackled from the pain of my past. Today, I stand here stronger, not because of him, but in spite of him. College was a transformative experience for me. Surrounded by peers who shared the same drive and ambition, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I threw myself into my studies, joined organizations, and even led a project that caught the attention of an industry leader. When I graduated, it was with honors and a job offer waiting, a milestone I knew I'd earned entirely on my own. My grandparents were there, of course, cheering the loudest at the ceremony. Afterward, we sat around a small dinner table, laughing and reminiscing about how far we'd come. "Your mom would be so proud," Grandma said, tears glistening in her eyes. It was a bittersweet moment, but it filled me with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. They were my true family, the ones who showed up, who supported me, and who celebrated every step of my journey. My career took off faster than I anticipated. With a background in project management and a growing network of mentors, I quickly climbed the ranks. I even started giving back, hosting workshops for young adults on financial literacy, something my grandparents had instilled in me from the start. It felt empowering to turn my struggles into a way to help others avoid the mistakes my dad had made. One day, while cleaning out my desk, I stumbled upon an old notebook. Inside were notes I'd written during the lowest points of my life, when my dad's betrayal felt insurmountable. Flipping through the pages, I realized how far I'd come. The fear, the anger, the sense of loss, all of it had been replaced by hope and fulfillment. I smiled as I closed the notebook, deciding to keep it as a reminder of how much I'd overcome. Occasionally, I'd hear about my dad through distant relatives or old friends. His business ventures continued to fail, and he'd burned through most of his bridges. One day, I received a letter from him. It wasn't the first, and I doubted it would be the last. The words were familiar, apologies mixed with excuses, promises of change wrapped in pleas for help. This time, though, I didn't feel anger or sadness. I felt nothing. I didn't respond. Instead, I placed the letter in a drawer and went back to my day. My life no longer revolved around his actions or his failures. He was a chapter I had closed, a lesson learned but not revisited. The biggest moment of closure came when I purchased my first home, a modest but beautiful place in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't just a house, it was a symbol of everything I'd achieved. On the day I moved in, my grandparents came over with a bottle of champagne and a plant for the living room. We toasted to new beginnings and shared a meal on the floor, surrounded by unpacked boxes and laughter. As the sun set, Grandma turned to me and said, "You've built something amazing here, Sarah. Your mom would be so proud." For the first time, I truly believed it. In the years since, I found peace in the life I've created. I've learned that family isn't about blood, but about who stands by you in your darkest hours. My grandparents are my rock, my mentors, and my biggest cheerleaders. They've shown me what unconditional love looks like, and for that, I'll always be grateful. Looking back, I wouldn't change a thing. The hardships, the betrayals, even the heartbreak, it all led me here. And here at this moment is where I'm meant to be. Because at the end of the day, my story isn't about what my dad took from me. It's about everything I've gained: freedom, resilience, and a life that's entirely my own.